Speaking of limitations, maybe we should really look into the limitations. I think there might be real limitations of AI. There might be limitations in people's perceptions. So yeah, maybe let's just spend some time talking about that.
Yeah, and this is important to me because I perceive a bit of a mismatch between some of the perceived limitations and the real limitations. In particular, one thing that really, I guess one of my pet peeves is people claiming that AI can't do something just because they give an example of it not doing that thing. So for example, if you ask it to do a calculation and then it doesn't do exactly the calculation that you want, and I mean, that is a real concern or potential limitation of AI systems because large language models are trained for semantics, not for computation. But typically, showing one example of AI not being able to do something is not in any way conclusive evidence that it can't do that thing. Typically, it's more evidence that whatever input or whatever, for example, prompt that you've given it is maybe not the best prompt. Or maybe the AI model hasn't been kind of fine-tuned or adjusted in the right way for the kind of problem that you're giving it. What I like to say is, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So just because you haven't shown that AI can do something doesn't mean that it can't do it. So we need to be a little bit more robust before we can say AI can't do something.
Yeah. So I'll use a very I don't know. I think this is probably the same. It's like a child. If a child cannot do anything, it doesn't mean the child cannot do it. It simply is that the child hasn't learned it, or maybe it's not the child's problem, it's the parents' problem. The parents haven't taught the child yet. So is that what you're saying, basically?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Maybe you're even just not asking it in the right way. Maybe if it's a teenager, especially, maybe if you don't say it in the right way, then they're not going to do it.
So that's one difference between perceived limitation and actual limitation. Are there other examples that you have in mind?
Yeah, I guess one example that I see talked about a lot where people think that AI can do something when maybe it actually can't. And this has to do with kind of maybe getting a little bit meta here, but detecting when something was generated by AI. So there has been a lot of talk about being able to automatically detect if, for example, a piece of text was generated by ChatGPT. And I think this is particularly of concern for market researchers because they want to detect if someone is being fraudulent, if it's not a real respondent. The short version is, as yet and in the foreseeable future, there aren't really any robust ways to detect if something was generated by a large language model. Part of the reason for this is because large language models are so good at what they do precisely because they've been trained on human generated data, specifically to imitate the same kind of things that humans have been generating. So, it's inherently difficult to be able to detect the difference between something that was generated by a human and something that was not. There's also all sorts of methods that people are trying to devise to kind of trick an AI into disclosing that it's actually an AI. And I mean, some of these might work with like specific, if you were to throw something into ChatGPT, then yes, maybe to some extent you can detect whether what it outputs, if you ask it, are you ChatGPT? Maybe it says yes. But that's kind of the most trivial case. The fact is there's hundreds, thousands of models available now. And a lot of them are open source. So people can really get these large language models to do all manner of things. And depending on the prompt that they use, they can make it very definite that the AI, for example, won't admit that it's an AI.
Okay, so that's very profound. So what you're saying is basically if you don't think AI can do something, it doesn't mean AI actually cannot do it. Or if you think AI can do something, it doesn't mean AI can actually do that. So what implications does that have? What can we do now? It's almost like, it's both good and bad, but especially on the latter example you gave, it's a real concern if we have more and more robot participants and we cannot detect. Are there anything that we can do about it?
Yeah, so I have a few opinions on that. But I guess for me, the strongest thing that we can do is to actually improve sort of what's happening behind the scenes when in terms of the panel companies that you work with. Right now, there's, I'd say, a lot of kind of systemic issues. For example, if you're working with one panel company, they might be sourcing respondents from another panel company, and there's not sort of that clear chain of where it comes back to governance. There's not that clear chain of where these people are actually coming from. And so we can implement better identification verification methods. So if we have those in place, then at least we know in theory who we're talking to. Then for me, it's less of an issue of whether text was generated by AI or not. It's more a question of whether AI is being used in a fraudulent manner. So what I mean by that is people are starting to use AI as an assistant, and that's going to be increasingly the case. I don't think we should be expecting respondents to never use AI. They're using it for all manner of other things. They're using it to help, inform their purchasing decisions already. So if they're using AI for that, then they're going to be using AI to fill out surveys as well. And that doesn't make it fraudulent. That just means that it's one of the tools that they're using. So for me, it's more about identifying or improving our identification verification and really sort of, being clear about what it is that we want to detect. It's not always the case that we just want to detect whether AI was involved in the generation of something.
That again is very well said. I mean, right now in the industry, at least there are a number of companies building really good tools for people to adopt to, for example, to generate automated reports. They're usually pretty good. So if for researchers to use AI generated reports, at least the summaries to start, is that fraudulent or is that simply an assistant? So like you said, for participants, the same thing. It's just a tool that they may be using it to get better answers. Maybe that's too hopeful, but
yeah. I mean, it is ironic that researchers are kind of fully embracing the use of AI to help with reports, and then they're also demanding that respondents don't use it at all.
Then it's like professors can use their calculators to do whatever, but the students that they're not allowed to.
Yeah, exactly.